Well, today I would like to try something I've been thinking about for a long time, sort of a research paper on Lester Del Rey and fantasy. And I'm going to call this Trends in the SF, Fantasy, and Speculative Fiction Industry 1968 through 1982. I have heard some SF historians seem to think Lester Del Rey is responsible for the shift to adult fantasy in the 1970s and 1980s. But the facts point otherwise. I will present my conclusions first for those that do not have the time to review all of the evidence, which is actually quite a bit. I watched this unfold through reading the magazines 1968 through 1982, and just being an SF fan during this time. I wasn't just reading the magazines, of course, I was reading novels and going to the movies and going to science fiction conventions. So Del Rey did not cause the shift to adult fantasy. Hollywood blockbuster films and multiple sequel series SF. That was mostly the publishing industry caused that. In fact, Del Rey made multiple efforts to preserve traditional science fiction long before and long after being employed by Ballantine. He did this through his work in the magazines, starting in the 1960s, and the Del Rey line of SF. Del Rey was a very competent employee, along with his wife, and they did their jobs regarding Ballantine's directives to build their fantasy presence. So it became successful under his management, which his wife took over after Lin Carter's tenure. The paper trail of these mostly publisher-chosen trends follow. Now, I will be quoting Ballantine, Del Rey, Asimov, Bradbury, and Silverberg as they all discuss various aspects of the shifts in question 1968-1982. I will have links to all resources quoted embedded in the description and place any in my post section that do not fit in that description. Now, this is a magazine that I purchased after football practice when I was in the 9th grade. I just walked across the street and bought this at the drugstore. The magazines were in drugstores, grocery stores, airport newsstands. Science fiction novels were in all these places. I saw a great copy with the iconic city robot. At the same time, I picked up this magazine in the drugstore. I didn't purchase that at that time, unfortunately. I could go to the local airport and buy SF in the newsstands. It was a great time lasting through the 1980s. Now, this is the actual magazine that I purchased in 1968, and it has been pretty roughed up. But I picked up some years ago, probably about 10 years ago, a copy in fantastic condition. Worlds of If, September 1968. Frederick Pohl, editor. Lester Del Rey, managing editor. Judy Lynn Benjamin, associate editor. Bulge by Hal Clement. Flesh and the Iron, Larry S. Todd. Star Itch, Thomas J. Bassler, M.D. Down here, we have Dream Street, which is not bad, and Love Conquers All. Mac Reynolds, like Banco's Ghost. Larry Niven. I may not be pronouncing everything exactly correctly, but here we'll jump to page 48. And the magazines back then had all kinds of very interesting stuff. Dorothy Jones writing about Mr. Spock here. But what I want to cover is there is a letter In the hue and cry section, it is the first letter in the section, written by a New Wave fan, pardon me. The author does somewhat confirm traditional SF has a place. However, he also opines that learning from tradition and the past is a call from the grave and can be ignored as such. Generational learning from history is generally considered critical to human progress. This letter is an interesting read, and the author seems to employ the circular, confusing Hegelian dialectic of Big Brother. Freedom is slavery. And he also, 2 plus 2 could equal 4 and could also equal 60 million. Pohl and Del Rey's response is straightforward. And I'll just read that here. We agree there's room for all kinds of SF. We object only when new waivers or any other specialized types tell us their kind of SF is the only one that's any good and everything else is trash. Pretty straightforward response, and I think Lester and Frederick, highly respected SF editors, make their point. I will provide a link to this, a free link where you can read this entire magazine if you want to, and in particular the letter that I was referring to. Next, in this kind of saga of letters in the magazines, is Galaxy, February 1969. Another great issue of a magazine. And here we have, Frederick Pohl, Judy Lynn Benjamin, Lester Del Rey, really editing the magazine. And in here is Golden Quicksand, a great story that I reviewed a few weeks ago, or maybe even a couple months ago. And there are other great short stories in here, The War with the Faneuils, and Willie Lay's great department, the science department. But what I'm getting at with this one is Ballantine Books on page 13 announces their plans for a shift to adult fantasy under Lin Carter. Lester Del Rey and Judy Lynn were hired 5, 6, 7 years later, and there will be more on that I will discuss. But let's see what Ballantine Books has to say about fantasy. We have long brooded about a real fantasy publishing program, nudged along by, among other things, Jim Blish's enthusiasm for cable, or Cabell, I'm not really certain how that's pronounced. Now, since our privately expanding universe permits 2 SF fantasy titles each month, plus an honest-to-God, no-holds-barred adult fantasy, we can indulge a long-cherished dream. In order to avoid a tedious argument about definition of terms, let's not have one. An argument, that is. A modest sample of the creative thinking we do here at Ballantine. It allows more time for reading. And such delicious reading. William Morris, Lord Dunsany, George MacDonald, and that's all fine. That is all great. Hannes Bach, Clark Ashton Smith, and many more. But they go down here. The series is being edited by Lin Carter, who will be doing introductions for each volume, and his own book, Tolkien, Look Behind the Lord of the Rings, comes out in March. So at any rate, Ballantine has announced their intentions to move to adult fantasy in February 1969, long before Lester Del Rey ever worked there. Next up is Galaxy Magazine, December 1969. Now edited by, and I'm probably going to butcher this guy's name, it looks to me like Eilor Jacobson. Could be Eller, I suppose. Frederick Pohl, Donald Menzel's the science editor, and he has a great article in here, by the way. Lester Del Rey, feature editor. Judy Lynn Benjamin, managing editor. So in this episode, or in this issue, Galaxy announces their intention for an episodic adult comic strip called Sunpot by Bode. I believe his name is actually pronounced Bodie. This caused quite a bit of controversy, with the comic strip disappearing in the magazine, not the magazine disappearing, the comic strip disappearing approximately 6 months later. The magazine itself was dead about 5-6 years later. But I have blocked out some of this prequel or introduction to Sunpot, which was quite inappropriate for the magazine because it was geared mostly toward 15-year-old youth. So that got my attention when I was 15 years old as well. Worlds of If, August 1972. The complete novella, The Merchants of Venus by Frederick Pohl. This is great stuff. And once again, we have Eilor or Eller Jacobson, editor, Donald Menzel, science editor, Judy Lynn Benjamin, managing editor, Theodore Sturgeon, contributing editor, Lester Del Rey, feature editor. We have Pohl's book and Zach Hughes' Unusual, the Book of Rack the Healer, and that's really about all I remember about it. But down here in the reading room, we have quite an intellectual and analytical examination of science fiction in August 1972 by Lester Del Rey. And I'm just going to read some of this, and this is going to take some time. For more than 40 years, readers and writers have been unable to agree on a definition of science fiction that would separate it from the general field of pure fantasy. Most early attempts at a definition relied upon science as the essential element in science fiction. But that effort failed. Some of the best science fiction stories involve almost no science, while C.P. Snow used a great deal of science in some of his mainstream novels. Speculation isn't the key word because fantasy is also speculative. Extrapolation? No, because you can't extrapolate a galaxy of aliens. We don't know anything about aliens, so we can't honestly extrapolate from zero knowledge. But we can guess, which a lot of people do, and that's fine. In effect, we have been forced to fall back on a circular definition or no definition at all. Science fiction has often been considered to be simply what science fiction readers like, and a science fiction reader is one who likes science fiction. And around she goes. Most often, we have simply assumed that everyone concerned with science fiction knows what the term means, even if he can't define it. If that idea were ever valid, it most certainly is not today. I recently completed the editing of an anthology entitled Best Science Fiction Stories of the Year to be published by Dutton. I had to read every piece of short to 10,000 words science fiction that was published during 1971 in the magazines and original anthologies. I found some very good stories, but they were buried in a shocking mass of stuff that offered very little reason for its existence. I kept no records, yet at least half of what I read, particularly in the anthologies, was everything but science fiction. Much of it wasn't even fantasies. The writers had somehow learned enough of the field to locate the markets, but if they ever read a science fiction magazine, they didn't understand the basic nature of the medium. It seemed to me that I must include a definition in the foreword to the book so that readers would know what to expect. I spent a week trying to find such a definition and then had to start from scratch to discover what science fiction is not. Science fiction is not fantasy. Well, I'm going to break this up a little bit here, but you're getting the idea that Lester is trying to make sense out of the science fiction that was being cranked out at this time. We'll go to this paragraph. Rationality should be a requirement of all fiction, but science fiction especially must not be irrational. You can't set up a story of the sun about to explode, which he actually did, and I have the anthology of those, collection of those stories over here in my library. You can't set up a story of the sun about to explode and then solve the problem by sending out a fire rocket to spray the sun with water and quench the flame. You can't set up a projection into the future made possible only by science and then neglect science. You have to think out whatever probabilities you choose, attempt to see all the ramifications, build your world as completely as you can, and then follow through within the limits you have given that world. Item, rationality. Now, he goes on this page, yes, I think that's enough. The writer frequently must create acceptance or identification rather than find it in a commonly accepted background. Item, fiction. Now, he also discusses alternate. So science fiction deals with alternates. A story detailing our normal present or actual past set in the near future and moved to a geographic locale not on any map is still mainstream. But a story rationally developed out of racial riots in a present and in which the South won the war between the states in science fiction. Let me read that again. But a story rationally developed out of racial riots in a present and in which the South won the war between the states in science fiction. So is any honest attempt to write about a future. Item, alternate. Now, we have a little discussion of fantasy here. Modern fantasy would deal rationally with alternate impossibilities, incidentally. So, Lester is making an attempt to figure out what science fiction is and what qualifies as science fiction. There is such a thing as speculative fiction. It probably differs from science fiction only when it omits the concept of the alternate. Thus, the matter of relevance would properly belong to speculative fiction when the relevance was keyed tightly to the realities of the present. In other respects, science fiction is also relevant, since all fiction should be relevant to the human condition. He's a little bit critical of the Clarion Writers' Workshop. He discusses a lot more here, and this is a very interesting reading. And of course, I have provided a link to the magazine and everything in it. So Lester really spends some time on trying to figure out what science fiction is and trying to encourage people to write it in this one. Next, we have the Fahrenheit 451 controversy, 1979. And this is one of my copies of Fahrenheit 451. Lester Del Rey began working at Ballantine Books in 1975, initially hired by his wife Judy Lynn Del Rey to develop a fantasy line. He was later set up to run the dedicated Del Rey Books imprint, which launched in 1977. In 1979, Bradbury is alerted by his students that Fahrenheit 451 has been edited at Ballantine. He contacts Judy Lin for help, and she takes action to restore the novel. Now, in response, Bradbury wrote Coda, included in many copies of Fahrenheit 451 from then on, since 1979. Reading Coda should probably be required to graduate from high school. Now, I'm just kind of kidding about that, but really it wouldn't be a bad idea. Here is Coda, 1979, by Ray Bradbury. He explains who notified him what was going on, that his stories were being edited by Ballantine, and he discusses that he gives Judy Lin a call and needs some help, and she immediately recalls a bunch of books and cleans up the prose and fixes all of this. And Coda is written as a response to discovering that editors at Ballantine Books had previously censored words from his novel Fahrenheit 451. Bradbury emphasizes that censorship doesn't just come from governments, but also from pressure groups, editors, and the public's own apathy. And he talks about a lot in here, and this would be important to read. The key quote from this, and it's right here. The point is obvious. There is more than one way to burn a book, and the world is full of people running around with lit matches. So again, I would really recommend this to be read by as many folks as possible, and I have a link to it. You can read it there. It's not long. So we're remaining in 1979, and I had the great good fortune to attend North American August 30th, September 3rd, 1979. Unfortunately, I was not able to get off work, and I did not arrive until Saturday morning. There is just amazing stuff in here. North American guest of honor, Frederick Pohl, fan guest of honor, George Sithers. And George Sithers becomes a pretty important factor in science fiction in the 70s. The Toastmaster is Lester Del Rey. I'm just going to kind of thumb through this so you guys can get an idea of the massive scale of this science fiction convention. Here we have the chairman's message. And I'm having trouble moving the pages, but you can see all the advertising from the book publishers, and lots of great stuff here being published. The Mote in God's Eye, Norman Spinrad, World Between, Colony by Ben Bova, and the Burroughs Bibliophiles. Everything you always wanted to know about North American. This was a huge undertaking. I couldn't believe the thousands of people there. More about North American. The t-shirts were $7, which was quite expensive at the time, and I did not buy one. Ace Doubles advertised here. A. Bertram Chandler, Ace Science Fiction. But then we get into the folks being honored. Frederick Pohl by Jack Williamson. A great read. I would really recommend this for everyone. Next, we have Frederick Pohl's advertisement for Jim from St. Martin's Press. Now, this is actually from 1953. Modern science fiction, its meaning and its future. And I'm guessing Mr. Bretnor had updated it sometime recently. They were reprinting it. George Sithers by Isaac Asimov. George Sithers. I've known George for 20 years. In 1959, he saved my life. I was coming back home from the World Con at Detroit, and I'm the world's worst traveler. I don't fly, and on this occasion, I was taking the train. I had gone to the convention alone and was returning alone, and I was not at all sure that I would survive some 15 hours or so alone on a train. By the oddest coincidence, George was taking the same train. Traveling didn't bother him. In fact, I've never seen anything bother him. He's always calm, always smiling, and always on the edge of a smile. Always with a look of deep benevolence in each eye. So we talked, or at least I did, and that saved my life. So he really likes George Sithers, and in late 1976, apparently, Joel Davis, publisher of Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, planned a new magazine to be entitled Isaac Asimov Science Fiction Magazine. So they are looking for an editor. Asimov says, I won't tell you how many names we considered. When all the suggestions ran down, I said George Sithers. So that's how George became the editor of most of Asimov's, all of Asimov's science fiction magazines. The SF Adventure magazine. And so George is now the editor of Isaac Asimov's Science Fiction Magazine, Asimov's SF Adventure Magazine, and is the owner of a Hugo for the Best Editor, 1978. Now, while Sithers edited Asimov's magazines, they were great. When Asimov fell ill after surgery and a blood transfusion, I believe it was late 1981 or 1982, he was not involved in the magazine as much, and George Sithers was replaced. I felt the magazine suffered greatly with the loss of George Sithers as editor. So here we have more information on the con and a great discussion of Lester Del Rey by Frederick Pohl. He ends up with, that's Lester for more than a century, more than a third of a century, one of my closest friends, one of my favorite writers, and always what Long John Nebel, radio talk show host, as I recall, used to call him on nighttime radio, the Magnificent. So we'll jump over here to something that I missed at this incredible science fiction convention. This is on Friday before I arrived. From 3 to 4 p.m. was Whatever Happened to Randolph Scott. Most people realize that Randolph Scott was a big Western movie star in the 40s, 50s, and even a little bit into the early 60s, I think. The changing role of the SF hero-heroine. Panel discussion, Jack Chalker, A. Bertram Chandler, and Gordon Dixon. Now, I did not get to see that, but what everyone was discussing at that time was that science fiction had changed quite a bit. The competent man and some optimism had been largely publisher bypassed in favor of moral ambiguity, pessimism, and largely monolithic concepts since around 1970. The competent man concept in SF goes back to at least Vernon Wells. The competent man/woman concept is not usually a Superman, just someone capable of rational thought. Norton's Shan Lanty and Storm Over Warlock, R.H.'s Kip and Half Spacesuit Will Travel, many Niven characters right through the 1980s and early 1990s. These are not super beings, but capable beings. A lot of this type of writing is in traditional SF, and this concept did not disappear completely, but was pretty scarce in the 1970s and beyond. I provide a link to this entire program on the FANIC site, and you can read everything in it. And it's really fun to look at for me after all this time. And I have kept it in essentially as new condition. Next is, as most of the magazines failed in the mid-1970s due to lack of interest in sales, Asimov saw his opportunity, which we just discussed, with a return to more traditional SF. His magazine took off with George Sither's editing. Here is my Asimov's SF Adventure magazine, fall 1979. Now there's some stuff in here that I will cover very quickly, as fast as I can. And of course, this is a great episode with a great issue. And we have Hellhole illustration, which is really quite good. Editorial The Boom in SF. We're going to take a close look at that. The Gerund by Frederick Longbeard, who's Barry B. Longyear, as I recall. The Things That Are Gods, John Brunner. Hellhole, David Gerrold, actually pretty darn good. And Frederick Longbeard, and with the Gerund, Barry B. Longyear, all kinds of stuff. It's just great, but first we're going to run back, if I can find it, if I can reach it, to this illustration from the Gerund. Great stuff, very interesting, and I enjoyed that tremendously. Then we're going to jump back to the Craig Miller Science Fiction in Hollywood. And over here you will notice a photograph of Ross Martin and Robert Conrad. Ross Martin, Joanne Harris, and Robert Conrad appear in the Wild Wild West Revisited. And he doesn't really discuss it until this page. CBS has completed production on a made-for-television movie called The Wild Wild West Revisited, starring Robert Conrad and Ross Martin in their old roles of secret agents James West and Artemis Gordon. The film is set 10 years after the series, with Grover Cleveland as president rather than Ulysses S. Grant. Paul Williams plays the son of Miguelito Loveless, the Michael Dunn role in the original series, and is out to conquer the world. So we have a new Wild Wild West adventure, and I watched it on TV. It was okay. It wasn't as good as the original series, I didn't think. The script fairly well captures the flavor of the old series, which could only be described as a science fiction Western adventure show, which everybody knew back in those days. Here is Isaac Asimov, The Boom in Science Fiction. I am frequently asked by reporters, how does the current boom in science fiction affect you? The answer is, not at all and in no way. The boom in science fiction to which you refer is in the movies and television. My own science fiction is in the magazines and books. The latter is doing well, thank you, but it is the former which is having its boom. And the two are of different species. They bear the same name, but there the similarity ends. This always surprises the reporters, and it may even surprise you, so let me explain. In order to do so, I must give you the two species of different names in order to avoid confusion. In the movies and television, science fiction deals primarily with images, so we might call it image science fiction. Since the show business people and journalists who talk about image science fiction refer to it abominably as sci-fi, suppose we call image science fiction I-sci-fi, or better yet, I-sci-fi, like eyeball sci-fi. The science fiction of magazines and books we can simply call what we've always called it, science fiction, or possibly SF. Now, I will disagree with Asimov on this just a little bit, and I'll come to that here in just a moment. The science fiction magazines had faltered badly from about 1969 through 1977. And Asimov was doing things to correct that. And he pretty well did for about 5 or 6 years. So he goes on to discuss here at the end, but we are not in Hollywood. We are here, and so we need only please 1/1000th the size of the audience that they do. We like to think that our 1000th part of the audience happens to be the best 1000th. It is an audience that can read, that likes its adventure with good writing stirred in, that has a respect for science even when it doesn't have a professional understanding of it. For that reason, we like you more than the money we make out of you. You see, we don't make enough money to fall in love with it exclusively, so we can afford to like you and write and edit and publish for you. We hope it shows. And it did. So I really enjoy this. And again, I have a link to it. You can read the whole article and everything in the magazine for free. And so that brings us to Del Rey's The World of Science Fiction. And I'm actually going to have to go grab that. Now, there is so much in this book that I can't really discuss it intelligently. It would take the rest of our lives, at least on video here. Now, I would really recommend this book to everyone. And, of course, there are other great SF references, but I have bookmarked what I feel are the most important stories or essays in the book and concepts. And this is just a great resource. Now, I bought this thing for $6. Unfortunately, many booksellers are asking kind of sky-high prices for this now. I could not find a credible, free online source for this. There is one on the Internet Archive, and you might want to check that out. But they want you to be a disabled person to read it, so of course I didn't do anything with that. But this is another great resource, and really, the history of a subculture, he is not kidding, and certainly worth your time, if you can find a copy. Now, next is Silverberg's Penetrating and Honest Analysis of SF Trends. Amazing Stories, March 1982. Silverberg's analysis, basically predicts monolithic SF by publishing house Decree. And I was kind of surprised to see him put that in words, but this is a fantastic, amazing from March of 1982. They were trying to make a comeback, and there's a tremendous amount of great science fiction, interviews, essays, and science fiction in here. We have the opinion on 4 from Robert Silverberg, some of which I will read, an interview with A.E. Van Vogt. There is a new story by Harlan Ellison in here, an old story reprinted, just a wild story, Ship of Darkness by A.E. Van Vogt, and The Trials of Rollo, Marianne Malsberg. And I didn't recognize many of the names of the folks who were running the magazine at this point. Eleanor Maver, editor, art director, Britton Bloom, Anna Gale, Richard Rouse, editorial assistants, Gary Freeman, staff illustrator, and Arthur Bernhard, publisher. So what we have here is Robert Silverberg talking about long sequel serials. Close students of the Hugo Awards process have pointed out that of the 5 novels on the 1981 ballot, 3, Larry Niven's Ringworld Engineers, John Varley's Wizard, and Frederick Pohl's Beyond the Blue Event Horizon, are sequels to successful novels, 2 of which were themselves award winners. A 4th nominee, Robert Silverberg's Lord Valentine's Castle, is in the process of acquiring a companion book, not exactly a sequel, but certainly a closely related work. And now comes a report that the 5th item, Joan Vinge's The Snow Queen, is due for a sequel shortly also. If the Vinge story is correct, it means that all 5 of the Hugo nominees will turn out to be pieces of some larger saga, an unprecedented and startling situation which says a great deal about the present state of science fiction publishing and consumer habits in the United States. The sequel phenomenon is nothing new in science fiction. Half a century ago, E.E. Smith, Ph.D., was winding up his Scar-like trilogy and getting ready to begin his 7-volume Lensman extravaganza. And all those books, which are quite spectacularly badly written, but irresistibly inventive, I actually think they're pretty well written, have had a large and enthusiastic following ever since Edgar Rice Burroughs. About the same time, Edgar Rice Burroughs, about the same time, was bringing forth his innumerable John Carter of Mars books, a Venus series, and of course the Tarzan items. Asimov's Foundation books caused much fuss in the 1940s, as did Van Vogt's Weapon Shops of Isher and Null A projects. The Professor Jameson stories of Neil Arne-Jones, Simax City, DeCamp's Viagens, Paul Anderson's Flandre, and Van Ryan-Tale's Blish Spindizzy's stories. The list goes on and on. No, nothing new at all. The popularity of the series for the writer is easy to comprehend. It allows him to serve up more of the same, to return to familiar territory, use well-established backgrounds and characters, and even in the case of the most mechanical of series concepts, the same plots. Science fiction is particularly self-devouring in its demand on the writer's inventiveness to dream up an entire world down to the smallest cultural and geographical details. And that is no mean task, minor task, I'm paraphrasing here. And to do it 3 or 4 times a year in a market that pays a cent a word or thereabouts is a formidable drain on even the most fertile mind. So he discusses this, and the worrisome thing about all those sequels and prequels on this year's Hugo list is that it shows fans voting overwhelmingly for more of the same, for the tried and true, for the cozily familiars. Publishers take note of such things. Already there is what I think is to be an excessive demand for multiple works. So we go on down here, and this is what he ends up with, and this is strong. What about Silverberg, now at work on Madripoor Chronicles? It is not, I insist, mildly a sequel to Lord Valentine's Castle, but it is quite definitely more of the same. I would be very much surprised to find myself writing a true sequel to Lord Valentine's Castle. The idea dismays and depresses me, and even though you might point out that I also found myself surprised to be writing LVC in the first place, I am fairly confident that it won't happen. But, so then he comes down and says, then why Madripoor Chronicles? Because I felt like it. Because I see the way the commercial winds are blowing, and writing is my livelihood, and because I thought I had left some things unexplored in the original book. All the same, when every book on the Hugo list is only a fragment of a greater work, something in the artistic integrity of the concept of the science fiction novel is being undermined. We are all merrily collaborating in a development whose sequel is likely to be trouble. So, very interesting stuff. Here is Van Vogt's interview. And again, I do provide a link to this magazine. You can read it in its entirety. And I shared Silverberg's concerns here, and I still do. Again, some historians seem to think Lester Del Rey is responsible for the shift to adult fantasy in the 1970s and 1980s. But that's not the case. I will present my conclusions first, which I've already done, for those that do not have the time to watch the evidence, which won't be here, because I already posted this above. Now, I watched this unfold through reading the magazines 1968 through 1982. Del Rey did not cause the shift to adult fantasy, Hollywood blockbuster films, and mostly multiple sequel series SF. That was mostly the publishing industry. And again, Del Rey made multiple efforts to preserve traditional science fiction long before and long after being employed by Ballantine. He did this through his work in the magazines in the Del Rey line of SF. So Del Rey was a very competent employee and did his job regarding Ballantine's directives to build their fantasy presence. And it worked, clearly. Also, Lester Del Rey, besides his efforts to retain SF in the 1960s and 1970s, published a lot of new and reprinted older so-called traditional SF as well during his approximately 15 productive years with Ballantine and his Del Rey line. Baen, Tor, and Doubleday, Warner, and others continued to publish some as well. I'll go through a little bit of that. Circus World, Barry B. Longyear, pretty much traditional SF, published by Nelson Doubleday, and most of these were published in Asimov's. And this was published, copyright 1980, by Barry B. Longyear. A great short story collection. And, of course, Niven and Pornell. I am not sure exactly how to pronounce Pornell, but we gave it a shot. And here we have Footfall, which I enjoyed immensely. And this is a Del Rey book. Copyright 1985 by Larry Niven and Jerry Pornell. And we also have Tangents by Greg Bear. And I liked a lot of Bear's work. And this is a collection of his short stories printed by Warner Books. And this is a great book. This book is still in great shape. Copyright 1989 by Greg Bear. Of course, we have blood music in here, analog. Now, this was published in a lot of other monthlies, I guess. I'm not familiar with alternatives, but here's another analog. Here's Omni, analog. Far Frontiers, which was probably a collection. Another Omni. And Sisters appears in this anthology for the first time. So, now let's go take a look at science fiction in the movies, which a lot of people didn't consider. I went and saw the first Star Trek movie, of course, and all the rest of them. And this is my program from the first movie. And again, I've kept it in great shape. There's nothing, all that earth-shattering about it, but it is a great thing to have and a lot of fun to look through from time to time. And we have Star Trek. I didn't particularly think Star Trek the Motion Picture was the best science fiction. Star Wars was okay. But we clearly have real science fiction, in Alien. And it's a definite, there's influence by A.E. Van Vogt's Black Destroyer and Discord in Scarlet. There's just no question about it. They had to settle with A.E. Van Vogt for that reason. We also have John Carpenter's The Thing in the early 1980s. I mean, this is based on Who Goes There by John W. Campbell. This is science fiction. I don't think that's questionable. The Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger and James Cameron. Some definite influence on this story by Harlan Ellison's Outer Limits episode Soldier. Definitely science fiction. They Live, John Carpenter again, and Escape from New York. I mean, it was sensationalized science fiction, but I think this one is more straightforward science fiction than Escape from New York or Escape from L.A. or it's an interesting story. And, again, what Asimov called I-sci-fi here, no doubt about it. This is an action, shoot 'em up, blow 'em up science fiction story, but still science fiction. Well, that's all I've got. There's a lot more, but I have gone on probably for way too long, and I'm going to give it up. I hope everybody has a great day.